That starts with you turn full circle when it's due, and the flame that warms your heart burn with love and hold us when we part. As true beauty grows with time, there's no need to hide the light. As true glances reciprocate, now is the moment worth a lifetime's wait.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third and final day of the Dingle Literary Festival 2020. And as Sheila said, I think you'll all agree that we're starting the day with a bang. We're delighted to welcome two highly respected writers who spend much of their time shining a spotlight on the threats currently made to our democratic structures. Anne Applebaum is a Pulitzer-prize winning historian, a staff writer for The Atlantic, and also a senior fellow of international affairs and Agora fellow in residence at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where she co-directs LSE Arena, a program on disinformation and 21st century propaganda. Her latest book, Twilight of Democracy, has just been published by Penguin. Also joining us this morning is Peter Geoghegan, an Irish writer, broadcaster, and investigations editor at the award-winning news website Open Democracy. He led Open Democracy's investigation into dark money in British politics that was nominated for a 2019 British Journalism Award and the Paul Foot Award. He is co-founder and current chair of Scottish investigative website The Ferret and lives in Glasgow and London. He is the author of Democracy for Sale, published by Head of Zeus. So maybe to start things off, I might ask both yourself, Anne, and Peter, the threats to our democratic structures that both of you have been highlighting. Do you see them as something temporary, due to the slightly nefarious influence of think tanks and outside groups? Or do you think that what we're seeing now in Trump's America or Brexit Britain, this is the new paradigm and this is what politics is going to look like from now on? Anne, maybe you'd like to start?
Sure. Thanks for that question, and thanks for inviting me. I really wish I was there, and I'm in rural Poland rather than rural Ireland, but maybe another year. So, I mean, unfortunately, I think the answer to your question is that politics has now permanently changed, that the rules that governed it, that the political lines along which people were divided we are not going back to some previous status quo. They've changed, they've really changed permanently. If you think about it, much of democratic politics and much of the democratic world, certainly in Europe and the United States, since the Second World War, has mostly revolved around questions of economics. Should the state be larger or smaller? Should we pay more to the welfare state, or more to healthcare, or more to the military? Should we engage in this or that foreign intervention or not? Politics more recently has shifted to become something else, and to become something much more existential, much more about people's identities. It's one of the reasons why people are angrier about it. I mean, if you think you're going to lose an argument about the size of the state, well, okay, you might be mad, but you can get over it and you know you'll have another chance 4 years from now. As politics becomes more existential, you may feel that by losing an election, you lose your identity, or your nation becomes something different from what you think it should be. And this makes politics angrier. There are a lot of reasons for that I'm sure we're going to discuss over the next, the next 40 minutes or so. And Peter's written brilliantly about the effects of dark money in politics, the changing rules of political behavior. You implied in your question, and this is of course part of the story too, that the nature of argument, the nature of the information space has changed so dramatically that we're not even communicating in the same way that we used to. Politics now takes place not in, civilized fora, or BBC, studios. It now takes place in very polarized online spaces. So some people live in a world with one set of facts, others live in a world with another set of facts. What's really disappeared is the sense of there being a public sphere and a place where everybody's treated equally and everybody's views are the same. I mean, this change hasn't happened everywhere in the same way at the same time. I guess we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the US, where it's particularly uniquely bad, actually. And maybe about Poland, which is where I'm now, or Hungary, but it's affected Britain too, and I think to some degree it affects everybody's politics. I mean, simply put, the amount of anger, the amount of the resultant polarization in politics is now with us, and it's not going away.
What's your thoughts on it, Peter?
Yeah, I think we can all recognize, I think, this sort of polarization. And even if you're in Ireland, I think you can see it. We can see it in politics in countries that aren't, as Anne says, the kind of headline grabbing countries for this, the United States, Hungary, Poland, even Britain. We have seen this kind of change in the nature of political discourse. And I think that goes hand in hand with the change in nature of political communication writ large. It's not surprising that the internet has disrupted lots of technology. How you order a takeaway has changed. How do you order a cab has changed. Well, it's not surprising then that how politics is conducted has changed. One of the things I try to write about quite a lot in my book and elsewhere, and others have too, is that a lot of time when we try to grapple with these issues, we are doing so with tools that are outdated. They're tools from the analog age. So we're trying to graft on analog tools onto a digital type of politics. And what I mean by that is, often whether it's things like electoral regulations, electoral laws, they are almost invariably outdated and unfit for purpose. Issues around how social media works, how the role of tech companies in politics, which kind of happened without any of us really thinking or talking about it very much. Almost overnight in terms of the history of electoral politics, we went from a situation where politics was something that happened, on the back of buses, on adverts seen at the end of your road, in newspapers, and at very specific times, really at election times. I think that's something we also politics has expanded. It's become far more voracious of time and space. It's not just something that happens every 4 years, in terms of electioneering. It's something that's happening constantly, and it's happening more and more online. And the way the online space and the lack of regulation around it has changed and shaped, and in many ways, I think, has warped our democracy. And I would agree with Anne, we're probably going to always have it. We're now in a new phase where it's going to be tit for tat and cat and mouse in terms of trying to keep up with changes and to try and kind of almost hold the democratic line. The concern is that I think, what we're seeing is that if you look at trust levels in democracy, I think this is one of the most concerning things we're seeing at the moment. You're seeing a real breakdown, especially in specific countries. There's a really interesting study that came out at the start of this year from Cambridge University, and they looked at trust in developed democracies. And they found that across the board, trust has declined markedly over the last 10 years, and particularly in two countries, the United States and Great Britain. And I think there's a real, you can feel it in Britain at the moment, you can feel it in America too, a lack of trust, not just in the information people are getting, but this political kind of systems and the public institutions. And I think that's really worrying. And I think that's the kind of ground in which, because in some ways what we're talking about, the attack of democracy, is also the rise of populism, the rise of quite authoritarian-minded political leaders. And that's a real space within which I think it's very easy to exploit. It's very easy to for political leaders to become the voices of of that sort of movement where, where trust is really, really low. And I think that's a dangerous place. I think a lot of elected politicians still haven't fully kind of realized as well just how low trust issues are. And the more and more we see issues around corruption, we see scandals, we see political malfeasance in public office, that all plays into that kind of lack of trust. And I think pushes people more and more into these kind of binary ecosystem, and the kind of anti-democratic sentiment that Anne has narrated so well in her book and others have written about too.
And the question for the two of you, maybe, how much of that do you think is intentional, that the very groups that you've identified in your book, Peter, who are looking to undermine and take over the democratic structures, part of their key strategy is to undermine trust in the existing way things function? It hasn't happened by accident. It's been a strategy over many years. And I think what was interesting in your book, Peter, is that it feels like it's happened overnight, but you tell a compelling story, all the way back to Friedrich Hayek in some ways, and the groups, particularly in the UK, who were looking to that Austrian model and trying to adapt it to British politics over decades, now not just years. And that's part of a strategy, isn't it? That you undermine the institutions with a view to overthrowing them. Isn't that how it works, Anne?
Yes. I mean, if you want to look at, I'd love to hear Peter answer that question, but if you want to see you want to understand a little bit of how this works in practice, I mean, you don't have to go as far back as 40 or 50 years ago. And I would actually argue that some things have changed more recently. And I wouldn't start this argument as far back, I think, as that. But look at the way that Donald Trump won the U.S. election. Look at how he entered U.S. politics. He entered on the back of the birtherist theory. So he was the primary, most prominent person who was willing to say that President Barack Obama was not born in the United States. He was born in Kenya, and that therefore he was an illegitimate president. Think about what that means. If the president is illegitimate, he shouldn't be president. That must mean that everyone, Congress, the White House, the courts, the FBI, the CIA, the police, everyone is lying. The whole establishment, every single person in politics, all of the media are all lying to you because, in fact, Barack Obama should not be president. He's illegitimate, and you are being taken for a ride. Something like 25 to 30% of Americans believed that. And the fact that so many people believe that indicates, of course, that this lack of trust was already there, and that the deep feeling that the state was dishonest was already implanted into the culture. But Trump used that sentiment, and he rode it further. He used it to win the Republican nomination, and eventually that same kind of sentiment to win the presidency. In the 4 years that he was in office, he deepened that distrust further, so that it's much more widespread now. It now includes, people on the left as well as the right who no longer trust the state or trust the political system or trust democratic institutions. And what we've seen over the last few days, since he lost the election to Joe Biden, is him once again using that distrust and that lack of faith that people have in democracy in order to make this presumptuous, extraordinary, outrageous, in fact, argument that he's not even really arguing anymore that he didn't lose. I mean, sometimes he talks about rigged votes and so on. He's now literally pressuring state level officials to discard democratic votes and choose him instead. In other words, he's trying to steal the election very openly. And now this is being done pretty ham-handedly, and it's pretty farcical in many ways. Nevertheless, it represents something new we have not had in US politics, not in the modern era. We have not had a president try to steal an election, to retroactively alter the way that people voted. And again, I'm convinced that it will fail. Nevertheless, the fact that he's doing it, it's only being made possible by the fact that people distrust the system so much. And of course, like his whole presidency, it will have the impact of making people distrust the system even more. Some percentage of Americans will always be convinced that this is a stolen election. And of course, he will then use that group, both for political, for personal reasons. Maybe he's going to use them to raise money. He's already using them to raise money, actually. He's sending texts and emails to people asking them to contribute to his legal challenge. Small print on the text saying that actually, the money is going directly to him or to the Republican National Committee. So he's already using this group to make money, and he will continue to do that. But he may want to use them for political reasons too, as he's investigated for fraud, for tax fraud, for other kinds of legal violations. He's going to call upon this claque of supporters to defend him. So we're seeing him making use of this deep distrust. As I said, it pre-existed. He'd expanded it. He's now expanding it further. And it's now a permanent feature of American US politics. And it is unbelievably destabilizing. We now have to ask whether in future, will anybody ever just accept the results of an election again? If you can challenge an election based on nothing, they have no evidence at all. If you can just do it by creating fuss, imagine what can be done with this, in the future.
But Anne, do you see that noise that Trump is generating currently and trying to steal the election? Do you see, once Biden is in office, do you see that dying away, or do you see Trump changing tack and trying to undermine everything the Biden-Harris administration do or try and do?
So I think Biden. I think the tone of it will change when Biden is inaugurated, and it'll be, these things will look different, and Trump's power will indeed drain away, and he won't have the support of the state, the institutions that he does now. But I do think that this probably presages an attempt to make the Biden presidency fail. Just like, remember, this was the Republican plan for the Obama administration: make it fail, and there will be an attempt to undermine whatever he does. They're already, by the way, putting kind of time bombs into, this extraordinary abrupt suggestion of withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan looks to be like an attempt to inspire a Taliban invasion. It's extraordinarily cynical. But the plan may well to be, as I said, to use this group of dissatisfied voters as a tool to undermine whatever it is that Biden is doing. So I do think it'll be a factor going forward, yes.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Peter, maybe coming back to bringing things back to Europe and what's happening in the UK. What's your take on Brexit and how it's going to pan out and the impact it will have on British politics, and what could are the Labour Party doomed to be observers of this for the next period?
Well, it's quite remarkable in some respects. I think if you're in Ireland at the moment, you're probably almost hearing more about Brexit than you are in the UK. We've kind of had this long period of stasis, coronavirus, and to be honest, a lot of kind of corruption, cronyism around coronavirus has become a big political discussion in Britain over the last kind of couple of months. We did a national audit report, a kind of spending watchdog report out earlier this week, which kind of really seriously castigated the government for what they said was essentially giving contracts to their friends without tendering processes. So we've got seeing that sort of kind of slightly kleptocratic aspect of British politics becoming more extreme. But at the same time, Brexit itself has slightly fallen off the political agenda in terms of the thing that people are talking about, which I think kind of is in some ways that surprising. It's been a long and drawn out process. And in some ways, it kind of fits into the kind of people who I've been writing a lot about, these kind of small purposeful groups of people who've been mobilized around Brexit, people like lobbyists, things like anonymously funded think tanks, the right of the Conservative Party. This is really the end game for what the right of the Conservative Party did want, which was to go into a situation where really it looks like it's going to be either no deal or a very thin deal. Even whatever the deal that comes out of the Brexit negotiations is the kind of deal that the right of the Conservative Party would have wanted at the start. This is going to be a minimal relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. It'll have a huge impact in Ireland, of course, but in terms of what it looks like, it is very much like back to Britain outside the customs union, outside the single market. This quite libertarian dream of Brexit, the idea of global Britain, the idea that Britain's going to kind of create new free trade alliances with countries around the world is the language that's coming out of Britain, even though it's this kind of tension that continues to exist within British politics, because you have quite a nationalist project on one hand, and that was how the Brexit referendum was won, a kind of sovereignty project, a conversation around, we need to take back control, in Dominic Cummings' famous slogan. And on the other hand, this kind of narrative of global Britain, that Britain will become a free trading nation. And that tension's riven the whole way through. Boris Johnson essentially has never made a decision on this, because the coalition was always unstable. This kind of new British right coalition is a coalition of economic nationalists and a kind of rump libertarianism. And that's a very, very unstable coalition. And Boris Johnson has attempted to try and keep those two things together right up until the very end. And that's where the Brexit, and whatever the Brexit deal comes out of it will be a product of trying to appease both of those things, which in many ways is obviously is not appeasable. We're already seeing those things like dire warnings about huge lorry parks and Folkestone and Kent and places like that, which are going to be backed up for ages. It's quite clear that this could deliver a pretty significant economic shock to Britain. I think it's underplayed just how much the kind of businesses that have been affected by COVID are not the same businesses that are likely to be affected by a really hard Brexit. If you look at, say, the pharmaceutical industry, that has actually done quite well in recent months, because obviously pharmaceutical is a big issue in a pandemic. The pharmaceutical industry could be really, really badly hit in a no deal or minimal deal Brexit. Similarly, car manufacturing and Nissan in Sunderland. But so that's the kind of, Brexit will still remain the kind of big fault line for British politics. The Labour Party has not said a hell of a lot recently on it. They have kind of continued their kind of being quite quiet on it. It's going to be interesting. I think the big question for Britain is what happens after January of 2021. Does Britain become a society riven by one big divide, which is Brexit, which is very much like America, or does it become back into some sort of plural politics? And we can already see in the Conservative Party an attempt, I think, to kind of hitch culture war issues onto Brexit. And this has been going on for the last few years, really, other issues around, race in Britain, statues, the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol, the playing of God Save the Queen at the proms on the BBC, all of these very, very tangential, and I think you'd probably argue in terms of political economy, incredibly marginal issues. The kind of things, as Anne said before, which when we used to talk about politics, we talked about things like who's going to run the economy and will it be a bigger state or a smaller state. These issues of identity, which have become existential, particularly in America, how big they become in Britain, I think, is the big unanswered question for like kind of 2021 and onwards. And does Brexit kind of become just this kind of almost dividing line, which even though Britain is out of the European Union, all the stuff, the constellation of things that went around it, the kind of ideas of what makes a voter, what's the future you want for your country, does that continue to constellate around these things? And I think there's definitely signs within the Conservative Party that they're very keen to try and keep that up. If you look at the kind of adverts the Conservative Party are spending money on Facebook, the kind of briefings you're getting about kind of what they're calling a war on woke, lots of kind of similar things. As I think there's an idea that they can try and culture wars this out, and the next few years will be a real test of if Britain really has become fully Americanized or not.
Okay, thanks, Peter.
I would add to that. It's absolutely true that the shift in political debate from real life stuff that affects people to incidents and outrages and video clips that you can interpret one way or another, to arguments about statues and flags and which you see both in the US and the UK. I mean, this is probably the most important shift, particularly in Anglo-American politics, although you can see other countries trying to do the same thing. And this goes back to the question you asked at the beginning, will that change? And I mean, I think the answer is, it doesn't change as long as that's what one of the parties, at least one of the parties, is doing. Sometimes, by the way, the left collaborates or cooperates in this in unhelpful ways. But it doesn't change as long as that's going on, and it doesn't change as long as there's an audience for it. The audience for politics and the what people now expect from politics is different from what it used to be. I mean, If you think about how people see and perceive politics, it's not the same. I mean, if you imagine that most people get political news, like all news, from their telephones, it comes in streams of sort of unranked bits of information. So there's a message from your cousin on Facebook. There's there's an advertisement for some, hairspray, and then there's a notice about the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. And then there's something about a riot in Portland, and you see a little video clip of somebody beating up somebody else. And this kind of stream of information makes it very hard for people to work out what's important, to work out what really affects them. And it creates a lot of cynicism and a lot of sort of irony and distance, in a sense that politics is something that happens somewhere else. It's nothing really to do with me. It's something that belongs to some kind of class of specialists. I don't have any right to be part of it, or I don't care enough to be part of it. And all of that is some of that is behind the change that we're seeing as well.
Thanks, Anne. We're going to be taking some questions from participants in a few moments. So anyone who has a question for either Anne or Peter or both of them, they can put them into the crowdcast chat, and we'll try and get to them. But just as you're in Poland, and I was just wondering if you'd like to give us some quick insights into what we've been talking about, that undermining of democracy from the right, what that looks like in Poland and where you think it's going.
Sure. This was one of the main topics of my book, Twilight of Democracy, and it actually begins with the New Year's Eve party that took place in the house that I'm in now. And then my reflections on that party 20 years later, when I realized that this was in 1999, that many of the guests who'd been there were no longer my friends, or no longer I didn't speak to them anymore, but that wasn't personal, it was political, and that the group of people who once constituted the kind of anti-communist movement in Poland had divided. And people were now very bitterly opposed to one another. And part of that group has gone on to become members of, leaders of, spokesmen for an authoritarian nationalist party called Law and Justice. This is now the ruling party in Poland. And I think what's important to note about them, and this is why their success constitutes a warning for others, is that they did win their original election in 2015 democratically. It's true that they won on a wave of cynicism and through the use of conspiracy theory in a very similar manner, actually, to Donald Trump. They wove an elaborate theory about the murder of the president who died in an accidental plane crash. And again, implying that the state was involved and everybody was responsible and everybody was being lied to. And it was a similar, again, using this fundamental distrust and seeking to win along those bases, but they did win. Once they took power, though, their goal was to begin to undermine the institutions of the state so that there was no longer a neutral playing field, so that the future elections would not take place under quite the same conditions. And when people talk about democratic decline or democratic erosion, this is what they mean. And this is now this and not some kind of coup d'etat with a colonel and a tank. This is now the real threat to democracies in Western countries, that political parties who no longer respect the rules take over and then begin to undermine institutions one by one. In Poland, it started with the Constitutional Tribunal, which is the sort of something like the American Supreme Court. It also included an assault on the state media. Public broadcasting in Poland, like in most European countries, is a very important source of news and information for a big part of the country. There's a lot of people in Poland don't have cable TV. They only get the public broadcaster, and the public broadcaster has now become a very extremist, I would say far right, very partisan broadcaster. Ran a very extraordinary homophobic campaign in the last presidential election. It runs anti-Semitic material quite openly now, talking about Jews coming to take back property from America, this kind of thing. And this is now mainstream discourse. It's the public broadcaster. It's like the BBC. And these changes to the institution have have undermined and and caused further decay in people's sense of trust and faith and so on. That's the process that we should be worried about. And by the way, it's coming from the right in Poland. I mean, it could, in theory, be a left-wing phenomenon as well. I mean, this is essentially what Chavez's Venezuela was. It was a similar kind of, he was also staged a similar kind of assault on the state. But that's not the threat that most European countries face. It's from these, we misuse the word populism because populism means a lot of things, and it sounds like popular, and it sounds like maybe it's something good. And there have been forms of populism in the past that have been, progressive or inclusive, or this isn't really populism. This is anti-pluralist. This is this is a kind of authoritarian nationalism. It's usually coming from the right. Right-wing parties in Poland and Hungary and France and Germany and elsewhere are all learning from one another, and they watch what one another does. In fact, this is why the defeat of Trump is important, even though it's been accompanied by this extraordinary, and very ugly 2 weeks worth of, false questioning of the election. His defeat is important because it will be felt as a defeat by these kinds of parties. And they learn from one another, they imitate one another, and they transmit ideas, and they learn tactics. And this is the threat in Poland to Polish democracy is also, I think, has been rightly felt by many Europeans to be a threat to European democracy. I mean, allowing this kind of the lawlessness to go on in one European state has a knock-on effect on others. I mean, not to mention the fact that Polish courts, the decisions taken by Polish courts are now not automatically accepted by other European courts because it's assumed that they're politicized, because there's this gradual politicization of the court system. And the EU is nothing if it's not a legal, it's a kind of empire of laws and regulations, if that's all it is really. And if you can't trust Polish courts because they're too political, then how can you do business in Poland and so on? So it really is a kind of cancer that could undermine the European project. And it really is right that other Europeans are taking this seriously. It's a very, very hard issue for Europe. Nobody, the EU wasn't set up with the idea that it would expel its members. And I hope we don't get to that. I hope Poland changes before that happens. But it's probably it's probably further along, and it's probably more serious than I think most outsiders realize.
Okay, thanks for that really, really interesting insights, Anne. Okay, I'm going to go to some questions from the audience. And I'll take one which comes back to a point about how the debate has become all about emotive issues of identity and other things that are away from big political issues like economics, and well, one of them being climate change, because there's a question from Anisha Verma, who's a 16-year-old, who asks if either of you can see climate action in the next few years in the Western democratic institutions, given the way that the turmoil and the way the political landscape is changing and is in such upheaval. Are issues like that becoming completely sidelined? Peter, maybe do you?
Yeah, well, just it's worth touching on. I think it's something that actually feeds into this question of democracy as much about future casting about what might happen with climate change. The very one of the reasons we are been so slow with climate change to do stuff is, obviously Donald Trump was basically saying it's all a scam and all the rest of it. But that followed 20 to 30 years of intentionally well-funded, anonymously funded work to undermine climate science. And so the kind of world within which these attacks on democracy have taken place, this kind of erosion of democratic norms across the Western world, was kind of the same people who were funding those kind of attacks were funding attacks on things like climate change. And it's the same actually tactics that went back to tobacco industry. And what you did was, and we see this all the time, where you create a false dichotomy, you create a false debate. We've even seen it around COVID, where you suggest actually the science is unclear. Here's one expert who's going to tell you one thing, but we found this other expert who's going to tell you something else. And often what we saw was the person who was pushing the climate change wasn't man-made or wasn't as bad as it was funded by corporate donors. We know this really well now. And the same kind of people like the Koch brothers in America, who created this dark money world, were really, really influential in pushing these narratives. And I think it's important, even if we think about how much action is going to take place, we have to understand how embedded the structures that allowed this sense of, and I think they fed into this lack of, this kind of attack on knowledge and on reality that we've been talking about this morning. Barack Obama talked about the other day about this attack almost on the meaning of knowledge. It's an attack on epistemology, on what does it mean to know something. And that was actually a well-funded, this isn't something that just came with social media. This has a long background. And there's a quite remarkable interview that Charles Koch, who's a billionaire who's donated, between him and his late brother, over $1.5 billion to various aspects of American politics, pushing kind of a libertarian agenda. He gave an interview recently with the Wall Street Journal, in which he kind of said, "Oh, maybe we've got this wrong. Maybe we kind of went too far with this." But the problem is that genie in some ways is out of the bottle. And the challenge now, I think, and we face a huge epistemic challenge with climate change too. I don't find it hard to imagine a future in 12, 18 months time, 24 months time, where the very basis of climate science also becomes up for grabs in the same way lots of other things have too. And I think that's something that really needs to be thought about now at the same time as action does.
Thanks, Peter. Anne, would you have some?
Yeah, I agree with everything Peter has just said. He's absolutely right that the doubt about the science goes back a long way. A lot of money has gone into creating it, and probably successfully in many places creating it. I would just say, particularly since the question comes from somebody who's 16, people who feel passionately about climate change and about this issue, I hope that you won't imagine that politics in the future will work if you only focus on this issue. I think climate protests are fine. I'm so happy that young people are engaged with it. I understand why it's such a compelling and important issue. But ultimately, if you want to change the way things work, if you want to change regulations, if you want the international community to work together, because this is an international problem, climate change. It's not something that can be only solved in your neighborhood, although things you do in your neighborhood also matter. But then you really need to be part of democratic politics. You need to be, I don't know, join a party, be a candidate, whatever you can do, even at a low level, is important. And simply because I think some of the climate activism has been actually counterproductive, because it's, seeking to stop the commuter trains in order to grab people's attention. I mean, that gets you newspaper headlines, but it doesn't really push the issue forward in the forums where it needs to be heard. You have to get people in politics at the top of politics who care about this and think that it's a priority. And in order to get that to happen, you need to win elections. And so I really hope that younger people who care about this, and I so admire them for being willing to participate, remember that as well. You need to, we live in democracies, at least for the moment. And since we do live in democracies, it's really important that we use our energy to affect, the actual politics of government, and affect, choose the people who are going to make the regulations, who are going to, who are going to tax fossil fuels, who are going to, who are going to create better conditions for wind and solar. I mean, all those things that have to be done. Just make sure you remember to engage in mainstream politics.
Okay, thanks a million, Anne. We're going to have to wrap up in the next few minutes, so I'm going to finish up with two questions in one, and I'm going to take and apologies to the other people who haven't had time to get to the questions. Thanks a million for your participation. And this one is from Antti Ruukkonen. I hope I've pronounced that right. And it's in relation to, given the assault that there has been, the sustained assault on the news media, how can we turn this around to restore public trust in the media in such a polarized environment? And the second part, I suppose, I'm tagging on to that, is that if you, as part of that, would either of you see any grounds for optimism as to how we can turn things round? Maybe yourself first, Peter.
Yeah, well, in terms of the assault on the news media, I think that it's really, really important. I would say this as a journalist, of course, I would say that it is important, like to buy and consume quality news outlets. But I think there is, we have seen that if you look at America, but it's not just America, it's lots of different states. But this idea of news deserts, places where people do not have the kind of news that they used to get. And we even see it, you see it in Ireland too, in terms of, say, that either the local paper is gone or the quality of the local paper is nothing compared to what it used to be. So at a local level, there's a lack of kind of democratic accountability through news media. So news media can do a great job at times at a national level to kind of do things like hold powerful people to account. And so if you look at something like the success of the New York Times under Trump, it's done very well. It's won loads of prizes. It's got huge numbers. I think last time I looked, it's about 5 million. But I think it could be even more now, subscribers. But at the same time, a lot of people who might have bought their local newspaper stop buying their local newspaper. If they're in a metro area in America, have stopped buying their local metro paper. And it's the same thing has happened across the United Kingdom and Ireland and lots of other states too. And I think that's created a huge, huge problem because, again, it is that digital disruption. You've seen the news media was funded by advertising, and that doesn't work anymore. And we had this great good, this really important good, public good called independent journalism that was kind of fortunate in being able to be funded completely externally by this other thing called advertising. And you would have this wall between them within newsrooms, and by and large that held up. The internet has disrupted that, and I think it's, I guess I would say this as a journalist, but it is incumbent for some sort of conversation about, well, what does that look like? What does 21st century, what does a quality news environment look like, and how do we get to it? And I do think that's part of trying to tackle polarization, because when you have online ecosystems where, falsehoods and fakery travels at light speed, the importance of having kind of verifiable information it's an even greater commodity than it was prior to that. And in terms of
sorry to cut across you, Peter. It's just we are a bit tight for time. I'm really sorry, but I would like to give Anne a chance to just come back on that for a minute or two before we wrap up.
No, right. So of course, Peter's absolutely right. News deserts, the lack of local news, all of this is these are deep and important parts of the problem. I mean, what I'd like to see happen under the Biden administration, and hopefully as part of a conversation with Europe, is a broader discussion of social media regulation and more broadly internet regulation, by which I do not mean censorship. I mean deeper ideas about how do we recreate a public sphere. Can there be such a thing as a kind of public broadcasting, public service type social media that people can participate in on some kind of equal basis? What are we going to do about anonymity? What are we going to do about advertising? What are we going to do about the power of the social media platforms? There are antitrust laws and other kinds of laws that can be used to reduce that. That to me has to be part of the answer. And then, as Peter said, the other part of the answer is, everybody who cares about this should subscribe to their local newspaper.
Okay, thanks very much, Anne and Peter. Really appreciate, on behalf of all of the team and the Dingle Literary Festival, thank you so much for giving us your time this morning. It's been an engrossing discussion. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to hear what you have to say. And don't forget, Twaddle Democracy from Anne Applebaum and Democracy for Sale from Peter Geoghegan. Two very, very interesting and engrossing books that I'd highly recommend. So thank you, everyone. And as I said, there's plenty of other events today. Please have a look at the agenda if you're interested in continuing to support the Dingle Literary Festival. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.